Back. Recently, I watched a new movie, some of you probably watched it, called The Jesus Revolution. And this was about a movement of people back in the late 60s and 70s. It actually reminded me of my own journey and my own generation, a generation that was trying to find itself in drugs, in sex, and rock and roll. However, what was great about that movie is it also reminded me of the huge impact that the revolution, the Jesus Revolution, had on my generation coming to faith and back to church. It reminded me of my early life before I came to faith and my journey towards Jesus. Before becoming to faith, I listened to music. I'm not going to name the groups because most of you sitting here probably won't know them, except maybe Bob and Jerry. So I'm going to just skip doing that one. But after high school, I entered college, and my friends in college, they were partygoers. And these were my high school friends and college friends that I knew for years. These were the people that I hung around with. And these were my best buds, and I enjoyed being with them. They would study hard during the week and party on weekends. I worked a full-time job in the business world at the time, so I had very little time to party. But trust me, I did my share. When I was 21 years old, I accepted Jesus Christ into my life as my Savior. I understood that my sins were forgiven on Calvary. I started attending a rather conservative Bible church, started reading my Bible. And the church that I attended was pretty much a typical Bible church at the time. We would hear sermons about good Christians needing to change life, change the music they listened to. I actually burned all of my, what we called records at the time. These were vinyl things, which right now would be worth thousands of dollars. So the pastor who made me do that, I hate. We would listen to worldly music, as they would call it, of the devil. We were told that the Bible teaches that we need to change our lifestyle, change our relationships, because the sinners that we were with would corrupt us and corrupt our faith, and so I did that. I stopped listening to the music that I enjoyed. I stopped partying with my friends. I made new Christian friends. As I grew in my faith, it was harder and harder staying in contact with my old buddies, my old friends from high school and college, because in all honesty, I didn't know how to engage with them in a lifestyle that I realized I didn't no longer approve or should approve. I didn't know how to hang out with them without judging them. I didn't know how to interact with them as they were living in sin. I didn't feel comfortable around them. I didn't think they should be doing what they were doing. So I started to disengage from the old crowd, my buddies from high school and college, because they were not Christians. Now, interestingly, as we look at now, social media like Facebook, we're social media friends again because of Facebook. And I noticed, though, that most of those guys that I hung out with are still friends with one another and still socialize and still party together. And I have very little contact with them except through Facebook. Now, I share this scenario from my life because it's an illustration of what I see even today as the great tension and question that followers of Jesus Christ have and ask themselves and wrestle with every day. How do we interact with the culture that we live in? How do we interact as Christians with those who maybe are against Christianity, are violently against Christianity, or want nothing to do about Christianity? Because Peter reminds us that we're a chosen people, 1 Peter 2:9. We're a royal priesthood, we're a holy nation, we're a people belonging to God, so that we can declare the praises of Him who have called us out of darkness into His wonderful light. See, Peter reminds us that as followers of Jesus, we have a special role as God's people. We are a special possession of God. Now later in the text that Pastor Josh read for us, I think we're going to have a better understanding of how do we interact with the world that we live in that runs in completely different circles than where Jesus wants us to be. How does God's people engage in a world that is so contrary to Christianity? That was even an issue in the Old Testament. God rescued his people out of Egypt. He meets with them in Mount Sinai, and Moses goes up and makes a covenant with God. And in that Mosaic covenant, God gives his people rules and regulations, guidelines, rules to live by. And one of the primary thrusts of the Mosaic covenant was that God's people were to be set apart from every other nation, from every other group on earth, as unique and distinct. God's special possession. But now we're the church, God's chosen people. And yet we still continue to wrestle with what does it look like for those of us who claim to be Christ followers to engage in the world that we live in? How do we interact with this world? Now, some have gone the very conservative route with a heavy emphasis on living lives that are totally separate from the sinfulness and the unholiness and the people who are aligned with that. The Amish would be a good example of that. There are church groups and denominations where there's an element of how do we set lines of marking out boundaries of who's in and who's out? And how do we make sure that truth is upheld? There are groups that have taken another approach. I would say a much more liberal approach. They basically said if you can't beat them, join them. So what do we do? Which path is a better path? Separation or participation? Well, before we answer that question, let me remind you of what John said about Jesus in the first chapter of his gospel. He said that the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. And we have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. John saw Jesus as a man full of grace and truth. And I think as we look to Jesus, who was a man of grace and truth, helps us to answer the question as to how we as Christ followers interact with the world. In the Gospel of Mark, chapter 11 and 12, we get a series of questions that the religious leaders, the chief priests, the scribes, and the Pharisees are bringing to Jesus over and over and over again to try to trap him. And our text this morning is one of those questions. The religious leaders are coming to Jesus and asking him about taxes. Should we pay taxes to Rome? Now, what exactly were they asking? Should we be subject to the authority other than God? See, let me suggest that at a deeper level, what I think they're really asking Jesus is this: how do we interact with the world that we live in as followers of Christ? What does it look like to interact with the political, social, economic structures of a world that will not support or point people towards the one that we believe is the living God? So let me share 3 principles that I think will help us to answer that question. The first is, I think, foundational. We need to define what it means to follow Christ. What does it mean to be a disciple or a follower of Jesus Christ? Because I think this will help us to set a foundation for the 2 other principles that we're going to look at from this morning's passage. As devoted followers of Jesus Christ, we need to understand that we live for an audience of one. As disciples of Jesus Christ, we live for an audience of one, and that is God. Now let me give you a little contextual background that's necessary to understand our text. In chapter 11, Jesus comes into Jerusalem, and the chief priests and the scribes and the elders are coming to him. As I mentioned, they always tried to trap him in his talks by questioning where Jesus got his authority to teach. And now in chapter 12, in our text, we're told that the chief priests, the teachers of the law and elders, looked for a way to arrest him because they knew he had spoken a parable against them. But they were afraid of the crowd, so they left and went away. So now we get to Mark 12, and they come to him and they say, there's flattery in their statement. They go, "Oh, Jesus, we know that you are a man of integrity, that you are a man of truth, blah, 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 blah." They're trying to kind of just flatter him. Because they didn't believe that Jesus was teaching the truth. They didn't believe that Jesus was teaching the ways of God. Remember, they were trying to discredit him. But the irony is, he is truth, and he does teach the way of God. So what's interesting in the text, depending on whatever translation you're using, it says this. They say, because you pay no attention to who they are. Now, that's not exactly what the Greek says. A more literal Greek translation would say, you don't look at people's faces. Basically, it's a statement concerning the fact that Jesus didn't care about what people thought about him in a very healthy and good way. He wasn't walking around looking at people's faces to see how they responded to what he was preaching and teaching. He didn't look at their faces to see if they approved or disapproved, to see if they liked or didn't like him. Why? Because he only cared about one opinion. The only opinion that really mattered to Jesus, and that is the opinion of God the Father. Jesus lived for an audience of one, and that was his Father. And what was true of Jesus ought to be true for you and me. We are called to live for an audience of one. Now, those of you who are married and those of you who are engaged, okay, Josh, probably too many years ago, but there's this young couple over here, Mikey and Sarah, right? Okay. I'm not going to ask Mikey this question, but do you remember when you first started dating Sarah? And Sarah, when you and Mikey first started together? When you fell in love with one another and how you care for one another, and you don't care what anybody else thinks because her opinion, and you're going to learn this in marriage, her opinion is all that matters. All right? As you continue the journey of love, you start running into all sorts of decisions, and virtually all of your decisions will filter through your girlfriend, your boyfriend, your wife, your husband. Why? Because you're living for an audience of one, your spouse. Another illustration. For those of you who have iPhones, I don't promote iPhones, although I have one. There is, on the iPhone camera, most of you know this, there's this thing called a portrait mode. And what I like about the portrait mode is this is what it does. It gives you a super clear definition picture of the subject of the picture, and the rest of it is all blurry. This is what it means to be in the audience of one. Our view should be Jesus. One super high definition picture of Jesus, and everything else needs to be blurry. All the faces are blurry because God calls us to live for an audience of one. When we are the disciples of Jesus Christ, we are living for an audience of one, and so we need to survey the picture of our lives when we look out in our lives. And what we should see is that super definition picture of the one, and that is Jesus. And everything else should be a blur in comparison, because his opinion, and only his opinion, is what matters. And I'm convinced that when we understand that we live for an audience of one, there is freedom in the framework. And if we're really honest, we do a pretty crummy job of it, myself included. And yet it's what we're called to do. A moment of truth. Please don't take this the wrong way when I preach here at Ruggles or any other church. I'm not preaching to you. To be honest, I don't care what you think about my preaching. Josh, because he pays me. I don't care if you like what I'm wearing. Why? Because there's just one that I should be up here preaching for. It is the picture of one. It is the high definition of Jesus Christ. And you're just a bunch of blurry faces because I'm preaching in view of the audience of one, and that is Jesus. And the same needs to be true for all of us. Whatever God calls us to do in life, you're not doing life for your mom and dad. You're not doing life for your kids. You're not doing life for your spouses. You're doing life for Jesus. He is the only audience you should have. And we are all ultimately responsible to God. We're not doing life for our relatives. We're not doing life for our parents. We are doing life for God. for Jesus. And everything we do should be filtered through what God's opinion is, because as followers of Jesus Christ, we live for an audience of one. That brings me to my second point. When we're living for an audience of one, we need to, as followers of Jesus Christ, let the world have the things that belong to the world. Moving along in the story, after the religious leaders used their version of flattery, they asked Jesus the question, Jesus, are we supposed to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Come on, Jesus, tell us. These religious leaders came to Jesus and asked Jesus whether it's right for good religious Jewish people to pay taxes to Caesar. Now, a little contextual context here. At this particular time, Israel was under the Roman Empire rule, and the emperor was Tiberius Caesar. Caesar ruled and reigned over Palestine, which for Israel was the source of incredible discouragement, despair, and shame. And so these religious leaders are coming to Jesus and they're trying to trap him. And really, in reality, when we looked at the question, there really isn't a good answer to that question. Jewish people think it's repulsive that they're occupied by another nation in the promised land, that they would have to pay taxes to a foreign nation. So if Jesus said, yes, you should pay taxes, well, the religious men think the Jewish people are going to be pretty disappointed with Jesus and possibly revolt against his teaching. On the other hand, if Jesus says, no, you shouldn't pay taxes to Rome, then the Roman authorities would probably have a little chat with Jesus about what he believed about taxes, possibly arrest him. They will have something to say to him because everyone was required to pay taxes. This was a Roman poll tax. It cost a denarius. Now, the coin issued by Rome, it was worth a day's wage for a common laborer. And on one side of the coin is a picture of Tiberius Caesar, and on the other side is the inscription that referred to Tiberius Caesar as divine. So the coin itself was highly offensive to the Jewish people because it had a graven image on it and the inscription ascribing divinity to someone other than God. So how does Jesus answer this trick question? Jesus threads the needle. When I first read this text, I oh, come on, Jesus, you can do better than that. He kind of threads the needle in answering the question. That's why, in some ways, the text ends with, they were amazed as to how he answered the question. But listen how he answers the question. He says, bring me the coin. And the religious leaders brought him the coin. I'll get to that in a second. And Jesus asks the religious leaders, whose image is on the coin? Caesar. And Jesus says, then give to Caesar what is Caesar and to God what is God's. Now, what I find interesting is Jesus didn't have a coin in his pocket, but it was like the Pharisees were pulling out hands of bills, if you will, lots of coins. They had these coins in their pockets. So even the question was devious because Jesus didn't have a coin and they did. So Jesus takes the coin and asks them what the picture is on the coin, and they responded, Caesar's. So Jesus said, well, that belongs to Caesar. It was understood even at that time that those coins were Caesar's property, even though they were in circulation. They were his property because he issued them, and he had his likeness on them. So what Jesus says is you don't need to get all worked up about this. It's not a big deal. The coin belongs to Caesar. Now, what I really think Jesus was saying here is he was implicitly saying that you and I can function in a system and structures of a broken and sinful world and still be faithful to God. All we need to do is learn to understand what belongs to the world and what belongs to God. When we determine what belongs to the world, then we can give it back to the world because it already owns it anyways. Render to Caesar the things that belong to Caesar. Let the world have the things that belongs to it, and we can give the world what belongs to the world. A little side note here. I think that there is something that has a mark of the world that is huge in the church. As Josh mentions, I'm the associate executive here in Massachusetts, but I'm also the executive in New Hampshire, Vermont. And what I find of the world, which really bothers me in the local church, is the clamoring of power. God doesn't call us to clamor for power in the church. He calls us to live as servants in the church. See, the Jesus kingdom is the upside down kingdom. The Jesus kingdom says that the first shall be last, and we can give power to the world. That's where the greed should be. We can let the world have greed. Anger ought not to be in the church. It's a mark of the world. It doesn't belong to God. Give it back to the world. Selfishness, godly ambition, abuse, lying. I can go on and on and on. These things don't have God's mark on them. When push comes to shove, there's power struggles at work, and we don't have to engage in it because we know that the answer is that we need to focus on the audience of one. As Christ followers, we can't play by the world's rules. We can let go of the things that belong to the world. We can let go of the world and let the things of the world be the world's. My third point, we need to give to God the things that belong to Him. We need to give to God the things that belong to Him because Jesus says this. Jesus asked the religious leaders about the image of the coin, and of course the image means likeness. And the coin had the likeness of Caesar. That's why Jesus told the crowd that the coin belongs to Caesar, let him have it. Now the question Mark doesn't record Jesus asking, because I believe that the question is completely implicit in the text. And that is, whose image is on you? Whose image is on me? Now the answer of that is actually in Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 and 27, when God said, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, over livestock, and on and on and on. But the part of the text I want you to hear is that they say, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness. The picture, the seal on us is that God created us in His image, the image of God. He created us male and female. So when Jesus says we need to give to God the things that are God's, what is He saying? I think He's saying that we need to give Him not only our tithe and our worship and our time of Bible study, which are all wonderful things, but I think what He's saying is we need to give Him our all. Because we bear God's image on us. And if He's saying give to God what belongs to God, to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, then the image of God on us means that we belong to God. And Jesus is saying God wants us all. We bear God's image and likeness. We know that we are God's image and we are the image bearers of God the Father. God wants our heart because He knows if He gets our heart, He gets our time, our talent, and our treasure. We are called to give ourselves to the one whose image we bear. So in light of this, how do we interact with the world that we live in? How can we possibly interact with a system and a structure that is so opposed to the ways of God and the things that He calls us to do? I believe the takeaway from this text is that we can engage in the world. Jesus is telling us that we can be a part of the system and still be faithful to God, because we still bear His image in all of those arenas by being able to discern what belongs to the world and what belongs to God. So here's the takeaway. If you're going to school, it's okay. Get your degree. Make some money so you get to the church. It's okay. If you enter the workplace, work to the best of your ability that people see Jesus in your life. Yes, and then the elections are coming up, and yes, we should vote if we're citizens. We should pay taxes. I think as Christ followers, we can serve in public office. We can buy property. We can have assets. We can invest. We can go on vacation. We can have hobbies. We can go to Patriots games and suffer, or go to Celtics and cheer. We can do all those things and still be faithful to God. In fact, I think we should. Because how are we going to love our neighbors if we don't know our neighbors? When I go back to the Jesus revolution and what I experienced in separating from my buddies, that was a terrible theology. Because how can I love my neighbors if I no longer associate with my neighbors? How do I serve the needy if I don't live among the needy? How are we going to bring the good news that there's salvation found in Jesus Christ if we don't know our neighbor? Yes, we can be a part of the world and still be set apart of God's chosen people. I grieve to this day because I believe I failed. I handled the relationships with my buddies from high school and college and the workplace in a very wrong way. I could have gone to the parties without partying. I could actually have gone to the bar after work with them. I wish I reached out to my friends, because I would be able to sit down with my friends, who many have families in a mess, some who are wrestling with issues of sexuality, who are questioning every aspect of their life. Then instead of backing away, I could have leaned in, not to condone their choices, not to be like them, to be one of the guys, not to walk with them in real time, but to let them know that I genuinely cared for them. I say this because I think that's what Jesus would have done. I can only say I think it's what Jesus would have done because it's what Jesus did. Jesus was called a glutton. Jesus was called a drunkard, a friend of sinners and tax collectors. Why? Because he hung out with the gluttons, the drunkards, the tax collectors, and the sinners. He didn't look at their lives and say, I can't be associated with these types of people. Matter of fact, he'd rather be with them than the religious people. He didn't say, I can't be a part of this or a part of that. Because he wasn't looking at their faces. He was looking at the hearts of the people that God loved. He did some scandalous stuff. I mean, think about it. He would go to Zacharias' home. And what was so scandalous about that is it was a dinner party with all sorts of sinners. And the religious leaders and the social elites were in conflict with one another. The religious leaders were outside in the courtyard, and the sinners were sitting at the table with Jesus. And there was a woman with a reputation that wasn't so good that came in and threw herself at his feet, wept over his feet, and let her hair down, which was not a good thing for a woman to do in society, and cleaned his feet with her tears and her hair. How awkward was that? Can you imagine if that happened today? We would be like frozen. And we have a lot more liberality today than they did in the first century Palestine. He was looking at their hearts. He wasn't looking at the faces of the people around him. He was looking at their hearts. The reason I say that so much confidence, say this with so much confidence, is because there's nobody in this room or anywhere else who deserves the love of Jesus, his compassion, his kindness, and grace and salvation less than me. And yet, he really has lavished it upon me. And even through time and time again, when I fail to give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar and to God what belongs to God, Jesus keeps coming back over and over and over again, reminding me that he loves me, reminding me that I am his, reminding me that I am his image. So how do we react to the world that we live in? And we're going to get into a much messier situation, I'll guarantee you, by November. We do it with grace and truth. We do it with grace and winsomeness as best as we can. We show the world that it is loved by a God who is greater than anything it could do or say. We can show the world that we are made in God's image and he loves them too, and that he died for them. So church, give to Caesar the things that belongs to Caesar, because the old saying is there's never been a U-Haul that followed the coffin. But give to God the things that belong to God. Amen.